Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here at Festival Puerto Ideas, a great event. I would like to thank Chantal Signoro and Natalia Pologaski for the organization of this great party of arts, culture, and science. I feel honored to interview Nicole Krauss, a great author, a great intellectual. Welcome to Chile. And I will read a brief text to introduce this distinguished guest. The extraordinary novels by Nicole Krauss are characterized by complex plots and a beautiful and enigmatic writing style. With a background in poetry and in academia, critics and readers acclaim her exquisite combination of sensitivity and erudition. Krauss writes about stolen histories and places. She is well aware that remembrance is not an abstract exercise, but one anchored in objects and places. In her books, lost memories have taken the form of a book, old furniture, discovered photos. Her characters have wandered through remote places, woven into a atlas displayed on the pages of her novels. Thus, places as far apart as London, New York, Budapest, and Jerusalem appear as contiguous spaces threaded together like a great geographic cloth. It is perhaps because in the author's own life, different origins come together. An English mother, a part Israeli and North American father who's here, so I don't know what we say also hello to Nicole's father who is present here, a Hungarian and Polish grandparents, as well as their own life in New York. It is interesting to see the presence of Chile in her fiction as a remote place shaken by turbulent political times in the 70s and on. The military coup, the clandestine torture centers, the detention of Pinochet at London. Also present are the port of Valparaíso, the readings of Pablo Neruda and Nicanor Parra, José Donoso and Roberto Bolaño. Also Chile is present through an inherited desk after a long chain of presences and absences belonging to a poet who is one of the disappeared victims of the dictatorship. Her latest book, Red House, is an ambitious novel in which each beautiful title chapter, All Rise, True Kindness, Lies Told by Children, Swimming Holes, functions as entrance to the voices of its protagonists. These are voices that wander through uncomfortable areas and well-kept secrets. Nadia, a middle-aged writer who reflects about the meaning of her profession and her hunger for owning other people's stories. Arthur, a man who tries to reconcile with the enigma of his dead wife, Lot, a Jewish German writer. Aaron, an elderly Israeli who regrets the distance he keeps between himself and his son, Dov. And Isabel, or Izzy, a young girl from New York who describes her love towards the son of the antiques leader, Weiss, an expert in recovering objects stolen by the Nazi regime. Nicole Krauss explores, with poetic breathing, issues such as the weight of inheritance, the silence between generations, the life of writers and artists, the link between parents and children, geographic uprooting, the memory of the Jewish Holocaust, the dictatorship in Chile. She has also written about objects as witnesses of story, a lost book and a desk circulating between several characters have driven the intense and complex plots of her novels which talk about the processes of reconstruction of memory and identity. Krauss houses are historical metaphors of destruction and ruthlessness. With the mind of an architect, she despises houses with her lost character wonder. Outside literature, the author says she's a pauper. When she writes a book, she takes refuge in that sphere of reality, and when she finishes, she's left in the open. Literature as a big house, a space connected by rooms and inhabitants, multiplying stories and voices. The creative process as the exercise of an architect who traces levels and limits, who creates a world while creating herself. Some years ago, Nicole Krauss came to Chile to be part of the jury of a literary contest. That time, her visit centered on her second novel, The History of Love. I keep the copy of the book where she dedicated me with a beautiful handwriting with warmth and luck, Nicole. So now, I have the book here. So now I say to her, Nicole, welcome to Chile with warmth and luck. And I'm sure Chile will be more than a fiction house, also a home with readers and friends. Nicole Krauss, today, the woman who walks into this room. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Andrea, and thank you to the festival for inviting me. As I think is obvious in the books. Can you hear okay? Yeah, okay. As I think is obvious, Chile has been a place that has had an enormous effect on me and has been both an imaginative space in my work, a place in which my imagination could expand into before I knew the real country, but also a place whose very real history has haunted me, has moved me, and ultimately become really a deep part of my own thinking. So it's wonderful to be back here again. Thank you for having me.
We're going to start the questions, this interview. I will switch into Spanish, so maybe the audience can follow the questions. We are going very good translators, so precisamente Nicole comentaba de la presencia de Chile en su ficción, y yo quería para iniciar leer un fragmento sobre el puerto de Valparaíso. Llega a ser mágico tener a la autora que ha escrito sobre nuestro país, y una escena de hoy en el puerto de Valparaíso que pertenece a la novela La historia del amor. Dice así: y Rosa relata que andando el tiempo se casó con su cuervo, que al morir su padre vendió la gran casa de su infancia con sus jardines fragantes y tuvieron dinero, que compraron un pequeño bungalow blanco en un acantilado frente al mar, en las afueras de Valparaíso, y Litvinov pudo dejar su empleo en la escuela durante un tiempo y dedicar las tardes y las noches a escribir. Pero nada dice la persistente tos de Litvinov, que a menudo lo hacía salir a la terraza en plena noche, donde se quedaban contemplando el mar oscuro, ni de sus largos silencios, ni de cómo lo temblaban las manos a veces, ni de que envejecía a ojos vistas, como si para él pasara el tiempo más deprisa que para todo su entorno. Es una pequeña imagen que habla de ese mar oscuro de Valparaíso, y también le pedimos disculpas a Nicole por el terremoto de hoy. La despertó a las 4 de la mañana y no pudo dormir, así que esta tierra tiene sus sorpresas. Le tocó vivir un pequeño temblor o terremoto, estaba por el límite. Lo que estuve leyendo, porque nos sentimos muy honrados que nuestro país esté en tu mapa literario, pero según entiendo, primero vino un país imaginado y luego viajaste a Chile. Te quería preguntar por ese contraste, en el sentido de escribir sobre un país que todavía no conoces, y que tu entrada a Chile fue por la literatura y por la historia política. ¿Y cómo era lo que te imaginabas cuando escribías? La geografía, este mar oscuro, el puerto, los lugares de memoria. Te quería preguntar por ese contraste entre lo imaginado y luego lo vivido.
There's an interesting way in which, when you're writing, you are constantly balancing what you know of the world, what you've experienced, which is, in the grand scheme of things, limited, right? So whether it's the places you've been to or it's the people you've known. So there's a balance between building on your experiences and your memory, but also an expansion into the unknown. I don't think writing would be at all interesting to me if I were limited to autobiography. What fascinates me about writing is the opportunity to expand into other lives and other places that are not my own. And in fact, I feel like one of the secret gifts of being allowed to be a writer is that my life has been multiplied infinitely, given what it could have been had I only lived the one life that I'm living in front of you in this body. But in fact, I have lived all of these lives that are in my books, and I hope to live many more. And I think that's something that, as a writer, you feel very early on, even in childhood, that you have this language, and the language can take you, whether it's the language you use, the language you read in books, it can take you to places that are beyond what you know, and you feel that this language is this vehicle to reach other places, other ideas. So for me, when I was writing The History of Love, there was, again, this question of balance between the places that I know. So you mentioned some of the places my family is from, and of course I grew up going to London to see my grandparents. Later they moved to Jerusalem, so Israel is a place I spent a lot of time in. So those are the places of my life, and I know them intimately, and I can evoke them easily and with a lot of emotion. But there's also this desire to imagine the unknown. And because I wanted to set part of The History of Love in a very far away, for me, far away place, for you, local, but I just simply imagined the farthest place I could get to. And Chile, when you're a child, you look at, if you're American, you look on the map, well, Chile is really the end of the earth, the other end of the earth for us. And it seemed just geographically, visually on the map, so fantastical. And Valparaíso, particularly so. And to me, it was like a kind of Calvino-esque invisible city, something already invented. And so I just simply imagined myself into this place without researching it. I knew enough to know the basic layout, that it's a port, and that the city is built around that. But the rest, I really didn't trouble myself with the detail because I wanted to preserve it as a place of freedom of the imagination. But afterwards, as you mentioned, I did come to Chile, and by that point, I already had other interests. I think naturally, once you imagine yourself into a place, it hooks you and you want to know more. And I really cannot remember how it happened exactly that I started to read about the history of your country under Pinochet and during the 70s. I really don't remember what was the hook that got me there, whether it was thinking about Chile, but somehow it happened. And not only did it happen, it became really obsessive. I read book after book after book about this period and was so haunted by it. I mean, sort of nightmares that kept me up at night much more than the earthquake did. And when I look back, I think in retrospect, my only analysis of that is that it was a moment in my life. I was pregnant with my first child. And of course, in my own family history there, because of the war in Europe, there was so much displacement and so much loss that I think when you are a child yourself, you think of it in one way. When you're going to have a child, suddenly you begin to, some of those fears begin to rise to the surface that were low underneath your whole life. And I think that I couldn't necessarily confront them head on. And so, again, this is only analysis in retrospect. I really can't say, but I think in retrospect that it was a way to like put on an asbestos glove and reach down to this faraway place to touch something that basically to touch this fear. Now I'm going to have a child, and from now on, all of my sense of well-being, of happiness, will depend on the safety of this child. And it's very fearful. It's a fearful idea. At least it was then. Now they're already, kids in the world. It's different. But I think it was a way to confront that and familiarize myself with that fear and overcome it.
Escuchándote, también escuchándote recién, y un tema que me interesaba conversar contigo, esto del desplazamiento, ¿verdad? De no tener raíces y al mismo tiempo, esto como comentabas, de Chile en lugar remoto, pero también cuando se tiene hijos, ¿verdad? O hay familia, qué importante es el espacio de la casa. La casa es algo muy presente en tu escritura, en tus novelas, y quería pensar en una imagen que acompaña, que está en La Gran Casa, la última novela que hemos tenido acceso de leer, que los personajes visitan el estudio, la casa de Sigmund Freud en Viena, les hacen un tour por la casa y ahí se dice que la casa, lo que se está señalando es algo más metafórico, que la mente es la casa humana. Quería, si pudiéramos un poco conversar de eso, de la casa como la mente humana, porque de hecho en tu novela hay 4 más casas que están interconectadas, y también con la idea del título de la gran casa.
I think the idea of the house, it works on many different levels for me in literature. One is simply that when you started the question with the idea of displacement, but even if we don't use the word displacement, if we simply say in our contemporary lives, we're such a world full of migration, we all come from many, many places. And when that is the case, particularly in my family, there was, my 4 grandparents were from 4 different places, and there was always this question of chance, the chance of landing up here rather than there, or the possibility of life could have taken place in another city, another country. That over time, I never felt particularly attached to any geography. And I think as a writer, I began to feel that the only way that I could create a sense of home was in my work. And I don't think that's unusual. I think many writers feel that. Some people talk about their only home, being a citizen of their own language, and I think the language is part of it. But really, I think when you're a novelist, there is a way in which you are building a home for yourself. You're building a structure, and so that moves to another idea, which is the idea of the novel as a house. And this is something that struck me really from the beginning. The first time that I sat down and tried to write a novel, I had come out of poetry. And in poetry we talk about the stanza. And a stanza, in Italian, it means a room, and that always struck me that a poem is like a room in that it has this, it has a quality in which you can reach everything at once, and you can perfect it. It seems to suggest that there's the possibility for perfection. Even though it's small, it can contain infinity, and you can labor on a poem for years, and it can be perfect. And I think that was too much for me, in a sense, as a young poet. And the first moments of writing my first novel, I felt this enormous relief. And immediately I began to think of the comparison to a house, which is to say that a house is never perfect. It has no possibility for perfection. Everyone who has ever lived in a house has dealt with the endless problems that the house they live in and the repairs it needs and so on. And yet, as a writer, it's very comfortable, for me it was very comfortable to live in this imperfect form. I mean, you think about a novel, we cannot say what that form is. Even when I say the word novel, I have a feeling that I am I'm just grabbing at a vague word to represent some enormous aspiration that I cannot put my finger on. It's just to make this long, structured something that is made out of words and that I hope will move people, that contains narrative, contains characters, but you can't exactly say what it is. And so then you're free, but it's also terrifying, and it's also an enormous opportunity. It's as if the novel is saying to you every time you sit down to write one, what will I be? What will I be? And I think this question of form has become more and more interesting to me as time has passed. And I really do believe that the structure of the novel, which as a reader you shouldn't be overly aware of, you shouldn't be thinking, but the structure actually facilitates all of those other things, the intellectual part of the novel. It facilitates the way that the ideas are put together. It facilitates how moved you are in the emotional life of the novel. All of those things depend on the elegance of the structure, which has to be invented every time. And so I have a sense of building these books, and building them very much from the inside, not from the outside, the way that I think architects build houses. An architect has a plan for a house, and he has the larger blueprint, and then he designs the details, she designs details down to the middle. But it's the opposite in my experience of writing novels, that you begin with something almost completely random, just some detail, and we can call that detail the doorknob. We would begin the house with a single doorknob, and then you have to build the door to which this doorknob fits, and then you have to imagine the room this door opens up into. And all the while you're doing this, you're making adjustments, you're beginning to get a sense of who might live in this house, what is the way in which everything joins together, and out of this you begin to build a house. And the house is finished in the last moment. You close the door and you walk away from it, and then you realize, so this is what I was thinking about, this is what I was building. And it's a strange thing, because we started this idea with being able to create someplace you can live in, but the writer never lives in that house in the end. Only the hope is that the reader lives in it, but because the writer has built it, she closes the door, and in a sense she leaves that house forever. And I've had that experience. You gave me a great house now because you want me to read something from it. And I opened it and I thought, who wrote this book? I don't remember anything here, and who lives here? But I don't live there anymore, but I hope other people for a little while will dwell there.
Y justamente esto que hablas de los detalles y de tu proceso de construcción arquitectónica, vamos a decir, perdón. Sorry. To wait. Again. Escuchándote y que hablabas de los detalles, y acabas de comentar un proceso que podríamos decir de contraarquitectura, al revés. Primero los detalles y después se arma la casa. Yo tengo mucha curiosidad por el mueble, por el escritorio de 19 cajones que mueve y moviliza la novela La Gran Casa. Nos sucedió algo curioso. En la sala que estábamos esperando allá, que detrás, había un mueble similar, un poco epifánica la escena, un gran mueble que hay aquí en la oficina, que es como un escritorio con muchos cajones. Y esta idea de los objetos perdidos. En tus novelas también pienso en la historia del amor. Hay un libro, un manuscrito en yiddish que se pierde y que moviliza la historia. Pero tal vez quería que nos centráramos en este ejemplo que es tan interesante y especial de un escritorio que va a ser tan importante en la historia de los protagonistas. ¿Cómo pensaste este escritorio de 19 cajones? ¿Por qué este objeto perdido? Tal vez los objetos perdidos son la sensación contraria de estar en casa, da mucha angustia. Pensaba en esas secciones que hay en los aeropuertos de objetos encontrados. Y te quería preguntar, ¿cómo pensaste este mueble, este escritorio, de cómo movilizaba las historias de tus personajes?
It always strikes me about how blind we are while we're writing to the origins, what we're quoting from. And this desk is a perfect example of that. What happened was the Great House started with a short story called From the Desk of Daniel Varsky, and it was published, and then it was collected in an American anthology. And by this time, I was already thinking about maybe expanding the story, but I really had not thought about it for a long time. And the editor asked me to answer the question, exactly the question you asked. Where did this desk come from? So in the back of the anthology would be a small interview. So I was sitting at my desk and I thought, where did this idea come from? And I looked up at my desk, and my desk is almost exactly like the one it's the one in my house that I work in. Is a huge desk, and it has a wall of shelves, not so many drawers, but shelves that rise up from it. And I hate this desk. I mean, I really hate this desk. I didn't choose it. When I moved into the house that I live in now, the desk was already there. And it was built by the former owner to very esoteric specifications. And it's very large, and it dominates the room. And worst of all is that right above my head, where the shelves are, he had, I guess, a work of art that he had built the shelving around. And he liked this work of art, so when he left, he took it. So this is just a big hole, empty hole above my head. And over the years, I tried to put like a bulletin board there, but it falls down. And so nothing, there's no solution, just an empty hole. And I hate it, but I always want to get rid of it. And as I was trying to answer this question, I realized, of course, this desk, I also inherited this desk. Of course, this is the inspiration for this story. But in the act of writing it, that wasn't accessible to me. And I think there's some funny way in which the writer's mind protects herself against knowing too much about, in the moment that she's writing, what it is that she's writing about. Again, I keep referencing this notion of freedom. It's so important, I think, to writers, so important to me to feel, when I'm writing it, to feel absolutely free from having to make an homage to somebody, free from having to respect something, free from having to be beholden to my life, all of those things. Writing has to be kept as a free space. So part of that is saying, oh yes, I'm just absolutely inventing. It couldn't possibly be that the desk is right in front of me, right in front of my eyes. So it started with that, but of course from there it evolved into many other things in the novel.
Y en esa libertad, y también en lo importante que es en tu proyecto la memoria y el olvido, te quería preguntar por ese ejercicio, por ejemplo, en la novela El amor, que está dedicada, dice, para mis abuelos, acá la foto de los 4 abuelos, que me enseñaron todo lo contrario a desaparecer. Te quería preguntar, por ese ejercicio, si sientes, y cuando estás pensando en tus novelas, si podríamos pensar en la literatura, en la escritura como un ejercicio contra el olvido, si esta herencia de destierro, de amenaza catastrófica, de pérdida, movilizaba tu escritura como un ejercicio contra el olvido.
Well, again, I would say that there's an irreverence in the act of writing always, which is when you write, you are going against the current of many other things that are happening around you. One of those things that's happening around you is kind of lack of observation and of forgetfulness. I mean, it's impossible to live and remember everything and record everything. So, of course, there is an element to writing, which is an element to stall time, to slow things, and to not only to preserve them, but to process them. I think much more than preservation is processing what it is that has happened, what it is that has happened. But if I can also turn that notion on its head, it really makes me itch to think of writing, think of my writing as a kind of respectful gathering of the past. It is not at all that to me, and the idea of the opposite of disappearing to me is not so much, oh, I'm remembering my grandparents, or I'm remembering the history of Europe during the Second World War, or what happened to the Jews, or any number of things. This never motivated my work, ever. I think, to me, the opposite of disappearing is something else. It's about going against the current of everything else. It's a kind of assertion of another reality or another idea that is not the obvious idea, or the insistence on looking at things which don't get looked at. So I think the opposite of when I think of disappearing, I don't so much think of things only being forgotten, but of things not being thought of, things not being considered, things not being processed, and nothing being made out of those things. I mean, I think part of why I'm a writer is that it's not acceptable to me that my life will only happen. I have to make something out of this happening. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to live to me. I don't really see how it works, except to say, I have this life, I have this experience, I have this mind. What can I make out of that is not my life, that is not reality, that is something else? And that's why I keep saying about this irreverence, or this going in the opposite direction of the current that life otherwise will just take us on, which is, we don't have time to think about those things, we don't have time to observe those things, or to consider them, or to make out of our lives another structure, a house, or whatever it is that we make out of our lives.
Y en un tema un poco distinto y también muy presente en tu escritura, los lugares. No es común ver una novela que transcurra en lugares tan remotos unos de otros. Está, por supuesto, Chile, que le agradecemos y que es bien interesante para nosotros. En la gran casa está Budapest, está Londres, Jerusalén, Nueva York. Y aquí te tenía una pregunta curiosa, porque yo hablaba un poco el título de la actividad, de tu mente como una mente de arquitecto y también una mente de cartógrafa. De algún modo tú estás trazando muchos lugares al mismo tiempo, donde ocurren tus novelas. Y te quería preguntar si primero imaginas el lugar y pones al personaje ahí, o creas al personaje en conjunto con el lugar. Pienso en Nadia en Nueva York, pienso en Lot, viene desde Alemania y después termina en Londres, en Daniel Barsky y sus idas y vueltas y su muerte trágica en Chile, en Aarón, en Jerusalén. Te quería preguntar eso, ¿cómo trazas e imaginas los lugares en la ficción, en el transcurso de la historia? ¿Los visitas los lugares? ¿Vas primero? Bueno, en el caso de Chile nos contaste un poco. Si el caso de Budapest, de Jerusalén, de Londres, entiendo que ahí viviste. ¿Cómo es esa dinámica? Es muy interesante.
I don't have the experience that when I'm writing the books, they have parts the way you describe. I'm not aware of the place separate from the character, or the character separate from the feeling, or the feeling separate from the idea. I think those things are when the writing is right, and it isn't always right. I mean, there are many years between novels when I'm writing and I'm not writing a book because nothing is working, and then it's parts. It's a character but no place, or it's a place and the story doesn't work. But when there's a moment that I have learned to recognize very well where what I'm writing feels alive to me. And I think that aliveness has to do with the fact that it's a whole rather than parts, or the world has authentic life to it. And I know that sounds strange to say because it seems that it is the writer's work to give it authentic life. I think that's true, but finding the spark of that life is often, almost always, accidental. For example, I remember when I was writing Leo Gursky, the very early pages of Leo Gursky, I had long sentences, and one of those sentences, sorry, for those of you who haven't read The History of Love, this is an old man who survived the Holocaust and who lives the rest of his life in New York. And he's very much alone, and he has these long sentences, and I looked at one of them and I thought, what would happen if I moved the period to the very beginning of the sentence? The sentence began, and yet, da 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 da. So what if I just moved the period and say, and yet? And suddenly it was one of these moments of like the mortal breath being blown into the character, because that phrase, and yet, it meant everything for this character. All of the things that had happened to him that he couldn't speak about. And just these two words were enough to evoke that. The desire to speak, the endless history and feeling, and the inability or lack of person to tell it to. And so that moment has nothing to do with anything. It was a period. When you ask me, is it a play? Do I set it in a play? Do I do research? No, it was just a period was moved and a character came to life. Maybe I'm simplifying it, but I think that is often what happens. In Great House, something similar happened with the character of Nadia when I put at the beginning of her part, Your Honor. And for those of you who have read the book, over a long period of time, you don't know who this judge or whoever she addresses as Your Honor is. Well, I also didn't know. For the longest time that I was writing this, I had no idea who she's speaking to. And yeah, it made sense to me that if I put Your Honor in front of this character's confession, let's call it, suddenly she makes a sense that I cannot explain yet and I cannot articulate, but I know that I will arrive at it, and I know it's part of what gives her her life. I know it's what gives her her urgency. Maybe that's another way to describe it. So I don't do a lot of research. I don't go with my pen and notebook to London or cities. I always say that I will. Oh yeah, I have to research this part, but it's happening now in the book that I'm writing. There's a part of it that takes place in Sfat, which is a mystical, a town in Israel with a very, very long mystical history of Kabbalistic thinkers. And one of the characters goes there, and as I'm approaching this, I thought, how am I going to write this? I really have to go there. I was there as a child, but I don't remember. I really have to go there to write it. Okay, I'll go there at some point. I'll just write it, and then I'll go check out. And then I wrote it, and maybe I don't have to go. It's right. So I think it's not the research, the reality of those places, or a lot of what I write, is not that critical to me. And it's not because my imagination is so good. It's simply that what matters is that you as a reader are inhabiting this character, and not that you believe this place, but that you believe him or you believe her. You feel what it is to be this person. And the details, in some sense, are a little bit irrelevant. Unless you happen to be from Valparaíso and you read it and say, this is not at all what this city looks like. But I wasn't thinking about getting caught in that sense. I wasn't thinking about a moment when somebody in that city would read the description of the city that I wrote, which I made up in my mind.
Bueno, estamos conociendo los trucos de Nicole Krauss y que nos ha engañado. Yo pensé que visitaba todos estos lugares porque son lugares geográficos tan remotos. Y ahí comentas algo que es interesante del proceso creativo y que es la oportunidad y el lujo cuando uno puede conversar con un autor en esto de la incertidumbre, que ni siquiera el autor a veces domina toda la historia o conoce toda la información. Y yo tenía otra pregunta, otra curiosidad como lectora, y yo comenté como la palabra de la ingeniería de la novela. Cuando uno lee Gran Casa queda sorprendido positivamente cómo 4 historias, es una narración coral de 4 historias, como comenté, que ocurren en lugares muy distintos, de personajes muy distintos, y uno dice, bueno, esto es imposible que en un momento se cruce, y se cruza, y muy bien. También ahí tenemos como a Daniel Barsky como un fantasma y también el escritorio. Te quería preguntar, en esto del proceso de escritura, si haces, yo me imaginaba un dibujo, una estructura, para que después las 4 historias de Nadia, de Aarón, bueno, Daniel Barsky, que está siempre ahí, de Lot y su esposo, cómo se cruzan, cómo el autor maneja eso, se cruzan en plan anterior o se van cruzando a medida que desarrollan la novela.
No, I don't have any of these plans that you describe, although it seems in the writing process that I should, because in a book like Great House it becomes really, really complex. But I have one notebook that's only maybe half full that has all the notes that I took for all of my novels in it. So this gives you a sense of how few notes I take. I mean, I take a lot of notes in my reading when things interest me, but I don't write a lot of notes or plans for the novels that I'm writing. Maybe a few with a character and an arrow here, an arrow there, but very little, and I don't really refer to those. So I can only explain that to you by saying the books are written, both The History of Love and Great House, and the first book too, but the first book is a more linear structure, but they were all written exactly in the order that you read them. So they were never shuffled around or edited afterwards and changed. They were written one page after another until the end. And I think I can only attribute that to the kind of, each writer has a different kind of mind, and that's the way that my mind works. It really can, my father and I were talking about this at breakfast, because I think he has a similar mind, but a very, very spatial mind that can hold many things in relationship to each other. And I think maybe that's why I keep referencing like architecture and engineering, because a lot of these things we think of as spatial, like their relationship. You can think of a novel with many ideas or characters in a spatial relationship, like this one connects to this one, and you think you could draw it. But actually you can't draw it. There's no way to diagram that. It's just something that I think the writer holds in her mind and understands in some intuitive way. That somehow this echoes this, but not exactly, because it echoes too much, it's too loud of an echo. And this idea juxtaposes with this idea, and between the two ideas we make a third thing, which is the connection between the two, which is really what a metaphor is, right? We take two disparate ideas which seem to bear no relationship to each other, or two disparate images, and we build a connection between them, and it evokes a sense of wonder in the reader, because suddenly she feels, yes, everything in the world is connected in the way that I always felt it was. And I think that's what I'm doing a lot, of trying to find these connections to create this whole, which is made up of many, many parts. And again, I relate this to our experience in life, which is that we go through life, and the experience of life can be so chaotic, and yet we have this absolutely enormous capacity, not as writers, as people, to organize our function of memory into something coherent. And we call that coherence the self, right? I am this organization that it really is a product of my mind, that I have organized my life to say, I am this, I experience this, and I make sense in this way. But actually that's really a creation. It's the beauty of the human mind, and it's something that we do that I don't think animals do, and it's really a wonder. And I think that it is not exactly reality, it is a creation in some sense. And I think that as a writer, I'm doing that on the larger level, not just of my own life, right? But I'm doing it with these many lives and many places and many ideas, that I'm trying to create a coherence that the reader, and even I on some level, cannot articulate. We just feel it, we sense this coherence, and it brings us to a point where something opens in us, something that's, I guess you could call understanding.
Yo pensaba, otro aspecto que me sorprende muchísimo, me hace admirar tu escritura, y algo lo comentabas con esta posibilidad
que da la escritura de ser otra persona. Y yo le decía a Nicole que si no tuviera la posibilidad de leer su biografía, para mí, al leer el libro, me imagino una autora muy mayor, con mucha experiencia, y hay una experiencia, una escritura de alteridad muy especial, muy linda. Tú le das una vida interior a tus personajes, que uno siente que son parte de uno, se hacen entrañables, todos, Arthur, Nadia, todos. Y me llama la especial atención tu capacidad para escribir y crear personajes hombres mayores. Está León, ¿verdad?, en la historia del amor. Y te quería preguntar específicamente por Aaron. En una entrevista leí que tú pensabas tus personajes como una flecha, que los imaginas como una flecha. Y me pareció muy conmovedor el personaje de Aarón. Aarón es un padre israelí. Cuento un poquito, si no leí la historia, que bueno, muere su esposa, tiene 2 hijos hombres, y cuando ha tenido toda la historia de desencuentros con uno de sus hijos, y cuando muere la esposa, se profundiza ese vínculo, y es un vínculo que nos dice, yo me imaginaba, nadie más que un hombre que ha sido padre podría escribir esta historia conmovedora, dura, de críticas y reproches mutuos, porque incluso hay una parte que el hijo quiere ser escritor y escribe una historia muy curiosa de un tiburón que devora cosas a través de los tubos, pero es un libro que también nunca se publica. Entonces te quería preguntar por esa experiencia de ponerse los zapatos de alguien tan distinto. Tú eres mujer, eres joven, eres madre, la experiencia de un hombre, padre de 2 hijos, y mucho mayor que tú, que tiene otras experiencias, el personaje. ¿Cómo construyes esos personajes? Tú, la psicología, investigas, lees entrevistas, observas. ¿Cómo construyes un personaje tan diferente a tu experiencia vital?
No to research, always no to research, unfortunately. I think the books would feel different, and maybe there would be elements of them that would be richer if I did do a lot of interviews, but somehow that's not my goal. There are sometimes stories that somebody will tell me that go into the work, and in the story of Aaron and Dov, there's a story about Dov being a soldier and what happens to him during the Yom Kippur War, and that was a story that I heard and asked about and incorporated into at least Dov's story. But if you're asking about how one gets into how it's possible to get into a character that is so different than me, all I can say is that I think when you read from a very, very early age as a child, you're getting this education. I would imagine this is most people in this room. You're getting an education in empathy, and it's an education that I do not think you can find elsewhere. Not that you can't learn about empathy elsewhere, but not in the way that literature teaches you. When you read a novel, you are given the opportunity to step into another person's life, into their mind. And it's a kind of fantasy that we all have in life, because of course we are supremely aware of the boundaries between ourselves and the rest of the world. We're supremely aware of how much or little we are understood by those we're close to at any given moment. We have endless misunderstandings and then great understandings, and this is the story of our lives, but it's never a perfect understanding. And I think we all have this wondering of what it is to be another, or this desire for someone else to experience what it is to be us. And when you read a novel, you have that. It is a kind of miracle, and it never ceases to cause amazement in me in a really good book, that I can enter that book and I feel I am this other, I feel what it is to be inside this other skin and this other life, and that life could be Japanese, and yet it makes sense to me. And I think it's simply that, having been educated in empathy from a young age, maybe having an empathetic leaning in myself. Sometimes I wonder if that's genetic. I really see that in my kids as well, just some kind of almost too much empathy, and a possibility of identifying so much with the other that one feels too much almost for the other, forgets oneself. So it could be just a tendency and something that was made more accentuated by reading so much. But I really feel this is my work as a writer, and this is, again, you discover what you're not good at as much as what you're good at as a writer. I can give you a very long list of things that I'm really not good at as a writer, but a lot of times they don't draw me anymore. For example, dialogue. A friend of mine said to me, there's like very rarely 2 people talking in your book, and there's never 3 people talking in your book. And mostly people are just talking to themselves, and I say, okay, it's true, like I read dialogue, it's not something that's my forte, but there are things that I know that are my own, and we talked about structure and building structure and juxtaposing very, very seemingly foreign stories and ideas. And another thing is this feeling of having a desire to get, and maybe ability to get right into another mind. I think the first person voice, which I've used a lot of, really facilitates that. But there's this desire for extreme intimacy that I've always had as a kid, because I think it's so hard. I don't find it easily in life, and that I know how rewarding it is, so I want it in the work. So a person like Aaron, he drew me, this old Israeli father. He drew me because he's so different, he's hard. When I first started to write him, I thought, he's really, he's cruel. There's something cruel about him. And I couldn't understand why. How can a father be like that to his son? And so I really wanted to understand him. And in the process of inhabiting him, I developed enormous feeling for him, enormous empathy for him, because I came to understand him. This is why he's like, what looked like cruelty was something else. So, and which is the case with all people once we begin to scratch. But it's very rare that you think, this guy is a complete jerk. And if you spend 2 weeks inside of him, after a while you think, wow, his mom was quite difficult, that was a hard child, but in this, and it's something you begin to feel, okay, maybe it's not justified, the action, but the person, we can understand how he arrived at this being who he is. And I think that process fascinates me, by which if you stay with somebody for long enough, and it was the case with all the characters in Great House, they are not immediately likable. In the history of love, if you're not charmed by Leo Gursky or Alma Singer, the moment you read the book, it's not for you. And I didn't want to do that again. I felt I wanted to find characters who were much harder, but if you stay with them for long enough, I hope that you feel for them, you understand what their struggle is, and I think that to me is incredibly rewarding as a writer, just to go through that process.
Característica muy propia de tu escritura es el trabajo que haces con la tradición judía. Los libros están con muchas referencias presentes, por ejemplo, malas palabras en yiddish, que uno, si las conoce, se ríe y después también las entiende. Tus personajes, hay un trabajo con el judaísmo, con su forma de vida, con sus traumas históricos. Y son tantos elementos que me quería detener en uno, en un concepto que se llama erup, y lo tuve que estudiar un poco para entenderlo, pero para la gente más religiosa, para respetar el día del descanso, el día sábado, el Shabbat, y respetar una regla que es no mover objetos fuera de casa. Para poder mover algunos objetos, incluso llevar las llaves de la casa, llevar los coches de los niños, se traza en las ciudades un territorio que se llama Eruv, que se traza a veces con un poste y se traza como un límite, donde la gente puede transitar con algunos objetos sin romper esa ley. Y me llamó mucho la atención porque también fue parte de un proyecto de una artista visual, Sophie Kohl, que estuvo en Argentina hace un tiempo atrás, una artista visual que hace performance, y ella hizo un poco este trazado y entrevistó a gente dentro de ese trazado, un proyecto que se llama también Eruf, que lo pueden ver, hay imágenes de estas entrevistas y de las fotos de los lugares. Y quería preguntar eso que es tan específico de la tradición judía, un elemento religioso. ¿Cómo funcionó en tu novela La Gran Casa? Tiene que ver con un tema, ¿verdad?, de las fronteras, de los límites, de qué consideramos privado y público, cómo también en lo público podemos vivir experiencias emocionales fuertes. Quería preguntarte por esa historia en específico.
This is another example of having forgotten what I wrote, because of course when Andrea told me about this, I said, what are you talking about? I don't remember that I put anything like that in the book, and then I had to spend 15 minutes looking for this about it. But I do remember, and it's such a beautiful idea, but the idea of the Eruv, I mean, there's an Eruv, which is this wire around a city. In so many cities where religious Jews dwell. Of course, there's one in Jerusalem, which is where Sophie Kahl based her project, but there's one in New Haven, you know. I mean, there are, and you would never notice them unless you really look on the telephone wires. You can see this little string, and before Shabbat on Friday, there's always one guy who walks the perimeter to make sure the string is not broken. And it's this also beautiful way of respecting a law, but also finding a way to live under the law as well. But Sophie and I went on a trip to the Arctic together, actually. We were on a boat of artists who were invited to go to the Arctic in order to learn about climate change, to witness the effects of climate change, and ideally to write about climate change. That has not shown up in my work yet. This is, again, the problem with research and me. But so after that, Sophie gave me her book, Eruv, and that book is really not about the boundary itself, but she took the idea of it and she went to Jerusalem and she interviewed people and asked them to take her to a place in the city that had some deeply evocative memory for them and to retell their stories, and she recorded those stories. So I used one of those stories in the book, and I think I can read it, it's a few lines, because it goes back to the idea that you're asking about, because although many of the stories in there didn't have to do with boundaries, this one did. So this is in Great House, and it's a waiter in Jerusalem who's talking. Actually, he's Palestinian, and he's telling Nadia, the writer, this story. He says, when I arrived here in 1950, I used to go to the border and look out. On the other side, 500 meters away, I could see buses and cars, Jordanian soldiers. I was in the city on the main street of Jerusalem, and I was looking at another city, at Jerusalem I thought I would never be able to touch. I was curious, I wanted to know what was it like there. But there was also something good about believing I would never reach that other side. Then there was the War of '67, and everything changed. At first I didn't regret it. It was exciting to finally walk those streets. But later I felt differently. I missed the days when I looked out and didn't know. So I think this idea of boundaries in the context of this particular story is moving to me, because there is this way in which we are endlessly yearning. I think the characters that I write about, one of the things that unifies them is how much they yearn, how much they're searching, and they yearn for something that can be another place, but it's also, I think, a yearning for transcendence, right? When to cross a boundary to get to the other side is to transcend what holds you back. But there's also, once you transcend, you leave behind the yearning, which makes our life. I have so many things to say about that. In my new book, I've been thinking about this a lot. And on one level, I think about it in terms of Kafka. I mean, Kafka has appeared in all of my books, I think, and the new novels, he appears even more so. And one of the things I find in reading Kafka is this beautiful but also deeply frustrating at times obsession with the threshold, to be on the threshold of happiness, of understanding, of paradise. I think of the most beautiful story in his book, in English it's called Parables and Paradoxes. It's just a collection of his short works. And he describes, maybe some of you remember the story of a man who goes to the door through which on the other side is what he calls the law. Well, you have a sense of the law, its understanding, its revelation, its paradise.
En español es antes de la ley. Ellos translated the title
Before
of
the
the
law.
short story.
And the man goes and he says to the doorkeeper, "Can I go in?" And the doorkeeper laughs and says, "No." And so the man sits and he waits his whole life. Because the doorkeeper says, "You can't go now, but maybe later." And he waits and he waits and he waits and he keeps asking, "Can I go in?" No, no, no. And finally, at the end of his life, he says, he's dying, his voice is thin, he can barely find the energy. He calls the doorkeeper over and he whispers, "Well, I have one question. My whole life I've been sitting here, and so many people must aspire to attain the law. Why is it that nobody else has come asking for permission to go in?" And the doorkeeper says, "Because this door was made only for you, and now I'm going to shut it." And it's the story that is it is the essence of Kafka, but it's also what is so moving, but so frustrating about Kafka, because you never can pass this threshold. And I was reading his letters a few months ago, and I found this line, and he's talking about being at a place in Eastern Europe, a kind of spa, one of those spa towns that people used to go to take the waters. And he's talking about hearing the children playing by the water, and he says, I wasn't happy, but I was on the threshold of happiness. And I find myself thinking a lot about this idea of what it is to be preoccupied with or paused with this place on the cusp of the other side, but in Kafka you never get there. And in fact, in life, you don't necessarily get there, but you live with the yearning to understand, to get there. Just to bring it back to one other idea, also, I think Kafka, though he never overtly spoke about his Judaism, was the most Jewish writer that has ever been, maybe only comparable to the person who wrote the Hebrew Bible. He's so Jewish, and one of the ways in which he is that, in Judaism there's the idea of the Messiah, that there will be a time in which the Messiah comes in and all will be reverted to a kind of fulfillment, that we will go from being finite creatures, we will be returned to the infinite. And yet there's this way in which, when you think about it, just in Judaism there isn't a great yearning for the arrival of that Messiah. There's a sense, when you look at Jewish thinking and Jewish life, that it seems that we are content to wait. And what do I mean by that? We're content to wait, that we're more interested in the question, we're more interested in the struggle, we're more interested in occupying the threshold than we are on the arrival or the revelation or the moment of transcendence. And so to bring it back to this story, I think the sense of this man that Sophie found expresses, I looked onto this other Jerusalem, I always wanted to know what it was, and then when it finally happened, I felt a loss, because I no longer could stand and believe. I could no longer stand and yearn for that other place. And I think our position as human beings, my position as a novelist, is on this, Kafka's position is on the threshold of yearning for, but never actually reaching.
Y en esto de los umbrales podríamos seguir conversando con Nicole infinitamente. Ella nos regala sus libros, la presencia de muchos artistas y escritores, entre ellos Kafka, Thomas Bernhard, hay unas películas de Kieslowski que aparecen, pero con Nicole habíamos pensado cerrar esta conversación leyendo un texto. Siempre tener a un autor presente tiene esa experiencia única de escuchar el texto con su propia voz. Yo voy a leer muy brevemente en español y después va a continuar Nicole para que tengan la oportunidad de escuchar la novela en voz de la autora. Hacia el final, elegimos un fragmento que es hacia el final de la gran casa. Dicen: de chico, quería estar en 2 sitios a la vez. se convirtió en una obsesión para mí. Hablaba de ello sin cesar. Mi madre se reía por mi padre, y llevaba consigo 2000 años de historia ya donde fuera. Del mismo modo que otros hombres portan un reloj de bolsillo, lo veía de otro modo. Quería atisbar en mi anhelo infantil el síntoma de una enfermedad hereditaria. Apostado a la cabecera de mi cama, a la que me veía confinado por una tos convulsiva que él no podía conjurar, me leía los poemas de Yuda al-Halevi. Con el tiempo, lo que había empezado como una fantasía se transformó en una profunda creencia. Mientras yacía en la cama, notaba como mi otro yo caminaba por una calle desierta en una ciudad extranjera. Se embarcaba el alba, viajaba en el asiento trasero de un coche negro. Pausa, otro. Cuando mi mujer murió, abandoné Israel. Un hombre puede estar en muchos más sitios que en dos. Me llevaba a mis hijos de ciudad en ciudad. Aprendieron a cerrar los párpados en coches y trenes, a dormirse en un lugar y despertar en otro. Les enseñé que al margen de lo que vieran desde la ventana, el estilo arquitectónico, el color del cielo al anochecer, la distancia entre uno mismo y uno mismo siempre permanece inalterable. Siempre los ponía a dormir juntos en la misma habitación y les enseñé no tener miedo cuando despertaban en plena noche sin saber dónde estaban. Mientras Joab llamara y Lea contestara, o viceversa, podían volver a conciliar el sueño sin necesidad de saberlo. Se estableció un vínculo especial entre ambos, mi única hija y mi único hijo. Mientras ellos dormían, yo movía los muebles. Les enseñé a no confiar en nadie excepto en sí mismos y a no tener miedos al dormirse. Estaba la silla en un sitio y cuando despertaban en otro. Les enseñé que no importa dónde pongas la mesa, ni a qué pared arrimes la cama, siempre que deje las maletas en lo alto del armario. Les enseñé a decir, nos vamos mañana como mi padre, un estudioso de la historia que me enseñó que la ausencia de las cosas es más útil que su presencia. Por más que muchos años después, medio siglo tras su muerte, estando al borde de un espigón desde el que contemplaba la resaca de la marea, pensara, ¿y qué utilidad tiene?
When I was a boy, I wanted to be in two places at the same time. It became an obsession of mine. I spoke of it endlessly. My mother laughed at my father, who carried 2,000 years with him wherever he went, the way other men carry a pocket watch, saw it differently. In my childish desire, he saw the symptom of a hereditary disease. Sitting by my bed, racked by a cough he couldn't shake, he read me the poems of Yehuda Halevi. With time, what began as a fantasy transformed into a deeply held belief. While I lay in bed, I sensed my other self walking down an empty street in a foreign city, taking a boat at dawn, driving the back of a black car. My wife died and I left Israel. A man can be many more places than two. I took my children from city to city. They learned to close their eyes in cars and trains, to fall asleep in one place and wake in another. I taught them that no matter the view from the window, the style of the architecture, the color of the evening sky, the distance between oneself and oneself remains immutable. I always put them to sleep together in the same room. I taught them not to be afraid when they woke in the middle of the night not knowing where they were. So long as Yoav called out and Leah answered, or Leah called out and Yoav answered, they could put themselves back to sleep without needing to know. A special bond developed between them, my only daughter and my only son. While they slept, I rearranged the furniture. I taught them to trust no one but themselves. I taught them not to be afraid when they went to sleep with a chair in one place and woke up with it in another. I taught them that it doesn't matter where you put the table, against which wall you push the bed, so long as you always store the suitcases on top of the closet. I taught them to say, we're leaving tomorrow, just as my father, a scholar of history, taught me that the absence of things is more useful than their presence. Though many years later, half a century after he died, I stood on top of a seawall watching the undertow and thought, useful for what? Years ago, when I first began my business, I received a phone call from an old man. He wanted my services and mentioned the name of a mutual acquaintance who had recommended me. He told me he no longer traveled. Indeed, he rarely left the room where he lived on the edge of the desert. It happened that I was going to be passing not far from the town where he lived, so I told him I would come to see him in person. We sat drinking coffee. In the room was a window, and on the floor beneath was a dark half moon from years of forgetting to close the window in the rain. The man saw me looking at the stain. I didn't always live this life, he said. I used to live a different life in other countries. I met many people and discovered that each had his own way to cope with reality. One man needs to reconcile a floor stained by rain in a room of a house on the edge of a desert, he said. But for another, the contradiction itself is the form the reconciliation takes. I nodded and drank my coffee. But all I understood was that in his regret was a stain on the floor from the rain falling in a city he hadn't been to in years. My father died 50 years ago on a death march to the right. Now I sit in his room in Jerusalem, a city he only imagined. His desk sits locked in a storage room in New York City, and my daughter holds the key. I admit that I did not foresee this. I underestimated her courage and will, her cunning. She thought she was denying me. In her eyes I saw a hardness I had never seen before. She was terrified, but her mind was made up. It took me some time, but soon the sense in it dawned on me. I could not have invented a more fitting end for myself. She had found a solution for me, though it was not the one either of us had intended. The rest was simple. I flew to New York, and from the airport I took a taxi to the address where I'd sent my daughter to retrieve the desk. I spoke to the superintendent. He was a Romanian. I knew how to make myself understood to him. I offered him $50 to remember the name of the moving company that had taken away the desk. He drew a blank. I offered him $100, and still he couldn't remember. For $200, his memory came back to him with dazzling clarity. He even looked up the phone number. From his small, dingy office in the basement where his street clothes hung on a pipe, I made the call. I was put through to the manager. Sure, I remember, he said. The lady said a desk. I sent 2 men, it nearly broke their backs. I told them I wanted to know where to send the tip they deserved. The manager gave me his name and address. Then he gave me the address of the storage warehouse where his men had delivered the desk. The Romanian hailed me another taxi. The tenant who owned that desk, he said, she went on. She went on a trip. I know, I said. How do you know? She came to see me, I said. And then the driver pulled away, leaving the surprised Romanian standing in the street. The warehouse stood near the river. I could smell the silts, and in the dingy gray sky, gulls were carried aloft by the wind. In the office at the back, I found a young woman painting her nails. She screwed the top on the polish when she saw me. I sat down in the chair on the other side of her desk. She straightened up and turned down the radio. One of the units in this facility is registered under the name of Leah Weitz, I said. The only thing it contains is a desk. I'll give you $1,000 if you let me sit at it for an hour. She will never have children of her own, my daughter. I've known that for a long time. The only thing she ever let escape from herself were notes. Child, pling plong, pling plong. Nothing else can come of her, but Yoav, there is something unanswered in Yoav, and I know there will be a woman for him, perhaps many women, in whom he will spill himself in order to seek the answer. One day a child will be born, a child whose provenance is the union of a woman and a riddle. One night, as the infant sleeps in the bedroom, his mother will sense a presence outside the window. At first she will think it's just her own reflection, haggard in her milk-stained robe. But a moment later she will sense it again, and suddenly afraid she will switch off the lights and hurry to the baby's room. The glass door of the bedroom will be open. On top of the pile of the child's tiny white clothes, his mother will find an envelope with his name written in small, neat handwriting. Inside the envelope will be a key and the address to a storage room in New York City. And outside, in the dark garden, the wet grass will slowly straighten up again, erasing my daughter's footsteps. I opened the door. The room was cold and had no window. For an instant, I almost believed I would find my father stooped over the desk, his pen moving across the page. But the tremendous desk stood alone, mute and uncomprehending. 3 or 4 drawers hung open, all of them empty. But the one I locked as a child, 66 years later, was locked still. I reached out my hand and ran my fingers across the dark surface of the desk. There were a few scratches, but otherwise those who had sat at it had left no mark. I knew the moment well, how often I had witnessed it in others, and yet now it almost surprised me. The disappointment, then the relief of something at last sinking away.
Gracias, Nicole, por permitirnos oír esta bellísima parte de la novela donde se cruzan todas las voces, todos los narradores y los objetos. Muchísimas gracias por estar acá, por compartir con nosotros tu bellísima, increíble escritura, tu pensamiento, tu experiencia como autora, y nuevamente gracias por hacer de nuestro país un espacio protagónico en tus libros. Y era lógico que algún día nosotros teníamos que ser los anfitriones y tenerte acá en Valparaíso. Muchísimas gracias por la conversación, y para los que les interese, Nicole Krauss, la autora, va a estar firmando libros afuera para que tengan su dedicatoria. Y nuevamente gracias a todos por estar acá y